You are standing gently in the shaded colonnade of a Persian garden, sometime around the late 10th century CE. The air is dry, but not unpleasantly so. It smells of clay jars and aged stone, and something faintly sour lingers of familiar temps, of pickling spices carried in the wind from a nearby courtyard. A scroll crackles softly in the hands of an elderly man seated beneath a fig tree. He is dressed in a loose woolen tunic dyed the color of old lemons, and beside him, on a flat stone, rests a bowl filled with sliced cucumbers, bobbing gently in a bath of brine. You have arrived in the era of the Buyid dynasty, in the heart of Persia, where courtly poets, wandering scholars, herbalists, and amateur vinegar brewers often collided at the crossroads of conversation in culinary invention. The dynasty technically Shia, but in practice a patchwork of secular rationalists. Mystics and bureaucrats offered an unusual haven for thinkers of many kinds. While Baghdad shimmered with Abbasid prestige to the west, Shiraz, Ray, and Isfahan thrived with quieter energy, the kind that grew in scroll-stuffed libraries and market stalls full of pickled turnips. This story does not begin with a war, a scandal, or a betrayal. It begins, quite simply, with a question: can a sour cucumber improve the soul? The debate, as mundane as it might sound now, first found a proper stage in the library gardens of Ray, a city nestled in the foothills of the Alborz Mountains. There, among students of medicine, philosophy, and astrology, a trend had begun to grow, one that could only have blossomed in the peculiar soil of Persia's intellectual golden age: the use of pickled vegetables as tools for moral and mental refinement. It was, as far as historians can tell, a trend launched by accident and sustained by wit. The initiator may have been Abu al-Hasan al-Amiri, a philosopher of Neoplatonist leanings and considerable dignity. El-Amiri had studied under Al-Farabi and was preoccupied, like many thinkers of his time, with the harmonization of philosophy and Islamic thought. He believed in the cultivation of the soul through knowledge, moderation, and structured daily habits. And one of his habits, noted by several later biographers, was his daily consumption of pickled carrots with crushed coriander and a dash of wine vinegar strictly for the humors. He insisted. The detail might have passed unnoticed had it not been for the poet Abu Mansur al-Thulabi. In his compilation of sayings and oddities Yatamat, Alda remarked with amusement that no mind in Ray was so brined as Amirius, nor any carrot so improved by contemplation. Soon after, students and rivals alike began to write small treatises, jokes, and long letters about the supposed link between pickled food and intellectual vigor. The debates, which began as jest, grew in earnestness. Could sourness purge melancholy? Did vinegar sharpen the mind by cutting through excess phlegm, as some Galenic physicians argued? Did moderation in pickling mirror the moderation of the soul? And more interestingly, could a properly composed jar of pickles express harmony in the Aristotelian sense? You see, in the philosophical discourse of the day, particularly within the schools influenced by both Hellenistic logic and Sufi symbolism, balance was everything. Hot and cold, moist and dry humoral medicine shaped not just diagnoses but diets and metaphors. A pickle, humble though it was a triumph of balance. It preserved the living by transforming it. It held rot at bay through a process of sour improvement. It was, in a strange and briny way, an image of the soul striving toward its better form. This idea, at first half-joke, was taken quite seriously by a group of alchemical-minded scribes in the court of Fakha al-Dawla in Isfahan. They wrote a curious scroll titled Risala fi al-Murakabat al-Ruhiyya, a treatise on the spiritual compounds, in which they proposed that certain pickling methods might parallel the sublimation of base metals into gold. In this way, they argued, the humble pickle was an image of the alchemist's soul. The vinegar was trial, the spice was virtue, the sealed jar was disciplined restraint. Now, not everyone agreed. One critic called Tawidi, famously grumpy essayist, responded in his Imtanwa al-Munesa, Pleasure and Intimacy, sort of nocturnal book of conversations, that such arguments were the ramblings of men with too much brine and too few books. He called pickles a seduction of the tongue and a distraction from reason, and suggested that anyone who thought a cucumber could lead to salvation should try fasting instead. Still, the topic persisted. In the medical schools of Jundishapur, surviving still in diminished form from their ancient Sassanid glories, students began experimenting with spice blends. Could a pickled eggplant, laced with mint and anise, improve liver function? Did pickled garlic stimulate memory? They kept diaries, now mostly lost, of their experiments. Women in merchant households, too, took up the fad, while we know less of their voices' history, being what it is records of household ledgers, suggest an uptick in purchases of vinegar, cloves, fennel seeds, and stoneware jars. One household inventory listed 18 different pickled items, from grapes to celery root. Under the label for discussion, one wonders what these discussions sounded like. There is one letter preserved in the Genisa of Cairo, written by a Persian trader to his cousin, that hints at this domestic element. He writes, "I am well, thanks be to the Almighty. My wife still insists the best pickled lemons are those we serve during readings of Avicenna. I disagree, preferring the onions for such things. This has caused much talk and some sleep lost." And so it was that the simple act of preservation became a proxy battlefield for much larger questions. What improves the soul? What disciplines the mind? Can everyday rituals, eating, drinking, storing, seasoning, be acts of philosophy? We do not know whether al-Amiri ever responded directly to the escalating pickled discourse. As later historians have dryly dubbed it, his writings remain lofty, focused on metaphysical unity and the nature of God, barely acknowledging cucumbers at all. Yet the world around him had taken hold of the idea with surprising seriousness. Even poets joined the fray. A lost verse, reconstructed from a damaged manuscript, reads, "He who brines his thoughts like turnips steeped in fire shall not decay, nor mold, nor falter in the mire." You could call it silly, or you could call it a kind of quiet genius, using the rhythms of daily life, of clay, salt, time, and taste, to reflect upon the shaping of the self. There is a final detail worth noting here. A small corner of a manuscript from the 11th century, held now in Istanbul, bears the following marginal note in faded ink. Reminder, ask Hakim Rashid, whether sourness is a necessary predicate of truth. And with that, we are left with a question. Truth is something sour, sharp, and patient. How do we best preserve it? You are now in Shiraz, late in the 10th century, in a dusty courtyard lined with low stone walls and terrace. Vines. The scent of vinegar once again clings faintly to the air, this time mingled with crushed rose petals and the distant waft of goat stew. It is near sunset, and the scribes have gathered, some cross-legged on cushions, others leaning against cypress trunks. They sit in a loose circle around an elderly scholar known simply as Sheikh Hamid of Shiraz, a man famous not for his mastery of law or poetry, but for his notoriously opinionated commentary on food. The discussion, as always, began innocently enough. Someone mentioned a treatise they had read, possibly written by a disciple of al-Amiri, on the 4 virtues of pickling: preservation, purification, pungency, and patience. Hamid, who had been quiet until then, set down his fig paste and cleared his throat. "You have misunderstood," he said rather calmly. "Pickling is not about preservation. It is about choice. The moment a cucumber becomes a pickle, it becomes something new, and that is philosophy." A silence followed, broken only by the soft plink of someone stirring a glass of watered wine. This kind of conversation was not uncommon in Shiraz. The city, known for its gardens and poets, also played host to traveling physicians, exiled philosophers, and middling bureaucrats with an excess of scrolls and opinions. In fact, it was here that the Jamiat al-Takamul al-Din, the Society for the Refinement of the Mind, was founded. A loosely organized group of thinkers who believed in the practical application of moral philosophy to daily living. They were mocked in Baghdad and ignored in Ray, but in Shiraz, they flourished. The society met monthly. One meeting was devoted to the ethics of walking slowly. Another debated whether sarcasm constituted a form of moral decay. But it was their 6-month symposium on pickles that proved most influential, produced a scroll titled Fi Ikhtiar al-Makalalat on the selection of pickled things. Now largely forgotten by history, this scroll reads like a gentle and mildly absurd manual of ethical eating. The central thesis: every pickle possesses a character, and the eater, by aligning themselves with that character, might refine their own. Consider a few examples from the preserved fragments. Pickled garlic: fiery, loyal, and quick of thought. Best consumed by those prone to hesitation. Pickled plum: melancholic but wise. For philosophers and widows, pickled turnip with saffron. Decadent, mildly corrupting. To be taken only during state banquets. Pickled cucumber with fennel seeds, balanced and contemplative, at the philosopher's choice. The scroll was structured as a dialogue, with one character, Ghazwan the Briner, advocating for moral enhancement through pickled substances, while his rival, Fadl the Abstainer, argued for raw, altered foods as the path to spiritual clarity. At one point, Fidel exclaims, "You would steep your soul in vinegar as if it were a sin to be fresh." The debate was theatrical. Yes, but beneath the surface ran a deeper current, a reflection on change and the role of artifice in life. Was the altered cucumber still natural? Did fermentation mirror the process of inner transformation? Could self-discipline be achieved through rituals as mundane as the arrangement of a spice rack? The students of Shiraz thought so. Curious. Result of this philosophical pickling fervor was the rise of so-called jar libraries. These were not literal libraries, though a few existed in backroom kitchens of more eccentric scholars. Rather, the term referred to a system of organizing one's pickled goods according to moral properties, rather than taste or type. In one surviving inventory, attributed to the mid-ranking tax official, Ahmad ibn Musa, we find this. Shelf 1. Items for sharpening debate. Garlic mustard seeds. Green olives with chili. Shelf 2. Items for calming the nerves. Beetroot. Rose. Petal preserves. Apple vinegar. Shelf 3. Items for self-examination. Bitter melon. Pickled lemon. Smoked shallots. While this may strike the modern reader as whimsical, it was taken with careful seriousness. These jars were arranged not only for consumption, but also for reflection. A guest in the home might be offered pickled fennel as a polite suggestion toward humility. Likewise, a sour grape might signal regret, a kind of edible apology. This practice spread quietly among the minor courts of Persia. In Isfahan, it is said, one vizier made it a rule that all new advisors must bring a jar of pickles as a gift and justify their choice before being granted an audience. Some failed this test miserably. Others, like the young merchant scholar Harun al-Kashi, brought an unassuming crock of pickled carrots, explaining, "I seek to see clearly, and carrots sharpen the eye." Nose hired immediately. Now we must pause here to clarify. None of these events were central to the great political movements of the day. While Bai generals marshaled troops and Abbasid caliphs plotted influence from Baghdad, these jarring debates unfolded quietly. But in them lived something deeper, a slow philosophy of life, one where patience and fermentation were held as values, and where the discipline of one's kitchen reflected the discipline of one's soul. That's not to say there wasn't resistance. In fact, the anti-pickle movement, if we can call it, that gained ground among the purists of Basra and some circles in Kufa. These thinkers, many drawn from theological schools, saw the entire pickled discourse as a distraction. Few treatises survive condemning the trend. Do not be led astray by vinegar-slick tongues and their jars of moral confusion, wrote one irate preacher. The prophet did not ferment his dates, and neither should you ferment your ethics. This criticism led to an official response from the Shiraz school. In a document titled Risalat al-Tadiyar al-Maklel, or the Epistle on the Governance of Pickles, they defended their approach. "We do not pickle the soul," it reads, "but we preserve its occasions for reflection." There is also mention in this text of the Night of 49 Jarza, now legendary evening in which a gathering of philosophers and physicians convened to taste and categorize nearly 50 different pickled items, each described in both culinary and moral terms. The event, held under lantern light in a terraced orchard, became the stuff of quiet legend. Later romanticized, its guest list included not just scholars but calligraphers, gardeners, and at least one retired astrologer who claimed that a proper pickle aligns better with the stars than half the charts I've seen. Whether this is true or not is impossible to say. But one poem, preserved in a mid-11th century anthology, offers a soft picture of the evening, under fig and firelight's gleam. Jars in rows like monks who dream, each one steeped in patient time, each a parable in brine. As the story of pickles and philosophy drifted west, toward Baghdad and east into the margins of Indian courtly texts, it began to take on a more mythical quality. In some Sufi circles, the pickle became a metaphor for ego, something that must be transformed, softened, and made digestible. Even the famed physician Ibn Sina Avicenna, though he wrote little about pickling, mentioned in a private letter that he found pickled quince to be most restorative to melancholy, and recommended it for moments of philosophical fatigue. Whether this was intended as an endorsement or merely good culinary sense remains unclear. So here we are, jars on shelves, ideas in brine, and minds stewing gently, but persistently on the nature of change, transformation, and taste. And yet one mystery remains. How far could this line of thought go? If the humble pickle could reveal the self, could it also define a society? So here we are at the tail end of this odd, wonderful journey where salted cucumbers and salted opinions mingled under desert sun and lantern-lit scroll rooms. The court of the Bides in the late 10th century had grown used to spirited discussions, but the pickle incident, as it came to be half-mockingly referred to by scribes, lingered in memory. Even after the formal debate between Al-Tawidi and the pickling guilds ended in what was deemed a tactical draw, no scholar was ever declared wrong only. Misaligned with prevailing humors, the reverberations lasted much longer. In the weeks that followed, several curious things happened. For one, Al-Tawidi received basket Cs, actual baskets of exotic pickled goods from various parts of the Islamic world. Vine leaf bundles from Andalusia, fenouiled olives from Damascus. Even a pickled melon rind said to be from the Sultan's own garden in Nishaper. Maha, some bore notes scrawled in eloquent Naskh script. From one preserver of thought to another, he wrote about these in his personal letters, occasionally musing over which was more acidic, the vinegar brine of Bustra's fermented lemons, or the biting tongue of Ibn Said, a rival poet he rather disliked. More importantly, the debate had set off a small but noticeable intellectual fashion. Across the scholarly circles of Baghdad, Ray, Isfahan, and Shiraz, philosophers began to incorporate more concrete imagery into their writings. Not just pickles, though. There was certainly no shortage of those but everyday items. Dust, sandals, lantern oil, cracked tiles, and yes, spoiled dates. The idea that lofty truths could emerge from mundane reflections had taken hold like the scent of cumin in a sealed market alley. Al-Tawidi himself began penning a short treatise, a blend of musing and mockery tentatively titled On the Moral Composition of Vinegar. It was only partially a joke. In it, he argued that vinegar, like a good argument, required both restraint and rot. Too sweet, and it becomes syrup. Too bitter, and no one returns for a second taste. He never finished that text, or if he did, no surviving copy has been found. But we do have his later work, Alimda wa Almu Nasa, The Enjoyment and Conviviality, which records dialogues and musings between thinkers at court, some of which include strangely specific discussions about brine ratios and the metaphorical implications of spoilage. One passage even refers to a philosopher who, misunderstanding the recipe for immortality, fermented his manuscripts and pickled his arguments. Some believe that's Al-Tawidi poking fun at himself, but the influence of this unusual debate reached beyond literary circles. In the kitchens of Shiraz and Tabriz, chefs began experimenting with vinegar balances more deliberately, as if composing culinary essays. There were even rumors that one military commander, convinced of the preservative power of pickles, required that barrels of garlic pickled turnips be included in his campaign rations for morale, he said. Or perhaps for metaphor. An idea that a society's values could be measured by what it chose to preserve its manuscripts, its customs, its foods grew slowly but steadily in cultural philosophy. By the 12th century, treatises on adab etiquette and cultured refinement often referenced food preservation as a sign of intellectual maturity. He who knows how to ferment a cabbage may also know how to ferment a nation's memory, wrote one scribe in Cairo, decades later. None of this would have happened, arguably, without that one night in Ray when the Sultan's dinner was delayed. The sour cucumbers caused offense, and a scribe philosopher with a restless mind began comparing fermented vegetables to ancient Greek paradoxes. And if you're wondering whether the pickling guilds themselves took much interest in all of this, well, they did, in their own way. A generation later, one obscure text survives, Kitab al-Makallalat, the Book of Pickled Things. At first glance, it's a simple culinary manual: brine ratios, storage instructions, notes on climate. But interspersed within are brief aphorisms, attributed only to the philosopher of vinegar. Things like salt does not preserve truth, but it slows the decay of lies. A cucumber in vinegar forgets it was ever green. It's too much garlic, and even wisdom weeps. Who wrote these? No one knows for certain, but some say it was the apprentices of the original picklers. Those who had listened quietly during the debate and later merged their craft with contemplative thought. If so, they may be history's first brine philosophers. What became of El-Tawidi? He lived a long, intermittently content life, writing, teaching, and sometimes lamenting that his truest audience was yet unborn. Men read me as one tastes. Sour pickles, he once said, with wrinkled noses and only later cravings. He died in relative obscurity, with only a few students at his side. But centuries later, he would be remembered fondly by scholars, as poets, and yes, food historians, as the man who once argued that the soul of a civilization might just be found in a pickle jar. And maybe he was right, because preservation of cucumbers, cultures, or convictions isn't merely a technique. It's a belief that something is worth saving, that decay is not always defeat, that sometimes the most lasting ideas come with a little salt, a lot of patience, and a slightly sour aftertaste. And so, the next time you unscrew the lid of a jar and inhale that sharp tang of something old, made edible, again think of Al-Tawidi, of a warm evening in Ray, of philosophers arguing over dinner, and of all the tiny, briny ways that history-boring, beautiful, persistent history finds its way into our lives. Would you like to begin story 2? If so, I'll share the next title from our overarching theme, somewhere along the East African coast where, the Indian Ocean laps at the frayed hem of old stone harbors and dhows. Bob gently like half-forgotten dreams, there once stood a town with no clear name, or rather, too many names. The Portuguese called it Vela das Sombras, the town of shadows. Arab sailors whispered Qaryat al-Kafitha, hidden village. The Shirazi merchants, whose families traced back to Persia, sometimes called it Niambaya, Kumbakumbudha, house of memory. But the Swahili-speaking locals simply called it Mjiwa, Watambazaj, the town of whisperers. And though maps no longer bear that name, and tourists skim right past the overgrown ruins buried behind hibiscus and sand, the stories have never quite left. Not really. Let's walk slowly. No, very slowly. The pace here was never hurried. The streets of this town were too narrow for horses and too ancient for wagons. Just coral limestone alleys smoothed by centuries of bare feet and soft rains. The walls were high and pale, built from sun-bleached coral blocks hauled from reef, beds then stacked in a honeycomb lattice so intricate that the walls seemed to breathe. Every morning at sunrise, the town would stir not with noise, but with scent. The air would fill with the soft bite of clove oil, the mellow sweetness of boiled cassava, and the hushed smoke of green incense curling from doorways. Cinnamon and sandalwood mingled with sea salt, and even now, they say, on certain humid dawns, the ruins still exhale those smells. It was not a grand city, not like Kilwa or Zanzibar or Mombasa. There were no tall minarets piercing the sky, no palaces, crusted with gold leaf, but the town was intricate. Every house had wooden doors carved with patient devotion spirals, vines and verses in Arabic calligraphy, so delicate that the sun would nest in their grooves each morning. And in every house, it seemed someone was listening. The residents were known to be quiet, not shijus, observant. Children were taught early to walk softly, to hear the shift in wind direction, and to listen to the walls, not metaphorically the actual walls, because they believed the coral remembered things, you see. Coral stone, unlike solid granite or sandstone, is porous. It absorbs moisture. And perhaps, they said, it absorbed memory too. Whispers spoken too close to the walls might echo years later, in different voices. Some dismiss this as poetic superstition. But if you ask the elders of Lamu or Pate Island today very gently, with proper respect, they might tell you of that one town further south where secrets had a way of surviving longer than people. It was a merchant town, yes, but not ruled. By greed, trade here moved like tidewater, rhythmic, inevitable, and never rushed. Sacks of saffron from Gujarat, fine cottons from Cairo, turquoise beads from the highlands of Ethiopia, porcelain shards from far-off Ming ports, and always the precious island goods, mangrove honey, dried octopus, and turtle shell combs. No one shouted prices. There were no painted signs. Only soft conversations beneath mango trees and nods exchanged. In the shadows of archways. But what made this town unique, what truly set it apart, was its dedication to stories. There were no scribes in long robes, no official chroniclers. Instead, every family was a vessel. Tales were passed not down scrolls, but into the rhythm of conversation. Children learned their lineage through riddles. Lovers wooed one another with parables. Even business was done with proverbs. As an old saying went, "To live here is to hear twice, once with your ears and again with your walls." Some believed it was because the town had no large mosque, no central gathering hall. Instead, worship and celebration were held in the narrow courtyards between homes sun-dappled, quiet spaces that carried sound in curious ways. If a verse was recited aloud in one corner, a friend sitting 2 streets away might hear only the last line, drifting gently through an open shutter. And oh, those shutters. They were made of driftwood, carved and sanded smooth, and painted in dyes made from tamarin, husks, and sea snails. They swung on silent brass hinges, fluttering like eyelashes. If you asked a local child what they reminded her of, she might say, "They're how the houses breathe." Strangers often felt uneasy at first. Travelers described a strange sensation, as though the walls were listening in, not in a sinister way, just attentive, as if the town were waiting for something, or someone. There were stories, of course, murmurs that some walls remembered so well they could repeat what they'd heard, though not in words but in feelings. One merchant claimed he once wept uncontrollably near the ruins of a collapsed spice house, for no reason he could name. Another, resting in a shaded niche after a long walk, said she suddenly smelled a perfume she hadn't encountered since childhood. Coincidence, perhaps? But in a town built on memory, even coincidence feels like a kind of inheritance. There was a legend passed in hushed tones from grandmother too, granddaughter of the whispering door. A particular wooden door carved with a spiral so fine that if you leaned close and placed your ear just so, you would hear a story, not a ghostly voice, not a riddle, but a full tale, whispered as though from inside the wood itself. No 2 people heard the same story. One woman heard a fisherman's love letter, never delivered. A young boy once claimed he heard the confession of a thief who returned every stolen coin. An old sailor, half-blind from salt and age, simply said he heard the sea apologizing for taking his brother. The door disappeared long ago, either sold, stolen, or perhaps crumbled to dust. But its tale remains, etched in the town's silence. Some scholars believe the town fell into decline sometime in the 15th or 16th century, perhaps due to a change in trade winds or a new harbor favored by Portuguese ships, or maybe it was simply forgotten, swallowed by mangrove roots and shifting dunes. The people, it seems, did not die in catastrophe. They just left, one by one, quietly, as they had lived. And now the town is more ghost than ruin. A few carved lintels peek from beneath fig trees. Walls lean like tired old men, pocked with centuries of wind. Sometimes archaeologists come with notebooks and measuring tape, scratching their heads at inscriptions half lost to time. But if you truly go not as a tourist, but as a listener, you might hear something. Not in your ears, but in the space between footsteps. In the breath of a shutter that moves without wind. In the hush of walls made from forgotten coral, you might hear a story meant only for you. The story of Juma, the scribe, begins, as most quiet tales do, with a mistake. It wasn't a large one. It's not the sort that topples kings or collapses empires. It was smaller than that, slight enough to go unnoticed. Except in a town like this. Juma had not meant to become a scribe. In truth, he had hoped to become a dhow builder like his uncle, carving ribs of wood that would carry cloves and coral across the Indian Ocean. But he lacked the patience, too. Sand the hole smooth or the strength to bend beams by hand. His tools always slipped. His calluses never formed. His uncle said he hammered like a drunk crab. So Juma took to sitting under the almond tree near the mosque ruins, sketching. Not the birds or boats as the children did, but words, he wrote. Them again and again, in the sand Swahili, Arabic, and even bits of Portuguese. Sometimes he copied prayers. Other times he wrote poems he half remembered from overheard conversations. When the tide crept close and washed his words away, he simply began again. An old woman named Bibi Salma saw him one morning and offered him a scrap of parchment. She told him he might as well let the earth keep some of what he wrote. That parchment became the first page of his ledger. And before long, the entire town began bringing him more. They came not with gold or news, but with moments. A dream someone wished to remember. A riddle overheard in the fish market. A dispute over a borrowed goat. Juma wrote them all, not as a judge or a historian, but as a careful listener. He never used ink straight from the pot he mixed it with. Salt water or cinnamon or ground shells, just to see how it aged. He invented a rule, only one sentence per entry. If someone tried to tell him too much, he'd wave his hand and say, boil it down. One line only. Let the coral remember the rest. And so his ledger grew page after page of tiny, precise sentences. Not arranged by date or topic, but simply as they came. A soft disorder, like the streets of the town itself. Some entries made perfect sense. Fatuma has not returned since the storm. Her lantern still burns. The moon was red last night, and the cat refused to enter the house. 3 cloves fell from my pocket, but I only picked up 2. Others were stranger. The mango tree whispered a name I've never known. My brother's laugh arrived in the wind, and he has been dead for 6 years. The wall behind the well has begun humming at dusk. At first, people laughed. Then they began to bring their own. They didn't call it superstition only, the record. Fishermen, before setting sail, would stop by Juma's house and murmur a line. Children brought him dreams they didn't understand. One woman left an anonymous note each week under his door, always ending with the phrase, "Tell no one, not even the ink." He honored that wish. He never read her entries aloud. Over time, the ledger changed color. Not in its pages, but in its presence. The townspeople treated it almost like a spirit of its own, a quiet guardian of memory. If someone claimed something odd had happened, a goat with gold-dusted horns, or a bird that sang in 3 languages, they'd ask, did Juma write it down? If he had, the story would be true. If not, well, perhaps it hadn't happened after all. Juma didn't see himself as anything special. He still walked barefoot, still stumbled over greetings. He still forgot the names of people he'd met 10 times. But his ledger grew heavy. He carried it in a cloth sling like an infant wrapped against sweat and sand, and always, always he wrote with care. Not because he feared getting things wrong, but because the town deserved it. It was a place that was remembered in whispers. and he considered himself one more whispering-stained, sand-covered, and slightly bent by the wind. But even in such a peaceful place, the outside world has ways of intruding. One year no one remembers exactly when strangers came. They arrived on a ship with black sails and silver buttons on their coats. Not soldiers, nor merchants. They called themselves scholars of the crown, which, to Juma, sounded like an excuse to walk into places uninvited. They spoke in clipped Portuguese and carried long sticks with glass lenses. They pointed at coral walls and murmured about ancient settlement patterns and non-alphabetic mnemonic structures. One of them snapped off a chunk of carved lintel and pocketed it without asking. Juma avoided them. The ledger well. They heard about it soon enough. A boy mentioned it while showing them the winding alleyways. The scholars followed the boy straight to Juma's door. "Ah," said one, "a tall man with fingers stained green. We're told you keep a kind of record." Juma did not speak. Another stepped forward. "Would like to see it. For the archives, you understand. You're preserving history." Still, Juma said nothing. They offered silver coins, then gold ones. Then threats, soft as silk but sharp underneath. Juma finally spoke. History is not a bird to be caged in glass. They didn't understand. He tried again. This town is alive. You can't press it flat and carry it away. The scholars did not like this. That night, while Juma was away gathering tamarind pods near the mangroves, his house was entered. Not broken in two, just entered. The door was not locked. Nothing here was. The ledger was gone when he returned. The town fell into a hush. No one spoke of it directly. Shopkeepers closed early. That the almond tree shed its leaves in silence. The dhows moored further from shore than usual, as though uncertain whether they were still welcome. Juma did not search. He did not weep. He simply began again. A new ledger, made from scraps. Old sails. Bark. Even fish skin. Dried and pressed. He wrote nothing of the theft. Not a single line. Instead, he returned to the morning rituals. One sentence at dawn, one at dusk. The town's pulse on the page. Years passed. Scholars never returned. Perhaps they grew bored or confused or lost in archives of their own making. No one knows what happened to the original ledger. Some say it was sold to a university museum, mislabeled and sealed in a drawer. Others whisper it burned in a storm at sea. One fisherman claimed he saw a page floating near the reef, its ink still legible despite the salt. But most believe something else, that the ledger found its way back. Not as a book, but as breath. That the walls absorbed it page by page. That every sentence now sleeps in the coral, waiting to be heard again. And sometimes, if you sit very still in the alley by the old almond tree, you might hear a voice not loud, not clear, but unmistakably patient. It will say something like, "The lantern still burns. The mango tree remembers. The goat is no longer borrowed." And you will not know if it is Juma, or the walls, or memory itself. But it will feel true. There are certain memories that do not cling to dates or decades. They float like dust in a shaft of light, waiting to settle on the mind when the hour is quiet and the air just right. The people of the forgotten Swahili port town never agreed on when exactly the backwards rain fell, only that it did. "Was it Tuesday?" said Mizzy Baraka, the spice seller. "Because I remember my stall was full of peppercorns, and I only bring those on Tuesdays." "No," insisted Asha, the coral mason's granddaughter. "It was a Thursday. I know because I had just finished braiding my cousin's hair, and we always do that on Thursdays." Others swore it wasn't a day of the week at all, but a day between days, one of those strange calendar folds that the world tries to forget but never quite can. But all agreed on the experience itself. It began with a silence, not the everyday hush of a sleepy afternoon, but a full, dense silence that seemed to push the air inward. The sort of silence that turns birds into stone and makes even the waves pause before they reach the sand. The clouds had been building all morning, soft and fat and low, like sheep waiting at the edge of a cliff. No one thought much of it. The coast was a moody place. Weather had its own language here. When the first drop of rain rose from the ground, rose, lifting gently like a bead of oil in water. Everyone stopped. There was a moment of disbelief. Then another drop lifted. And another. Boom. The whole courtyard in front of the mosque shimmered with droplets floating upward, slow and purposeful, like fish returning to the sky. Children laughed and reached up, trying to catch them. Old women crossed themselves and ducked under canopies. The fishermen stared, mouths open, their nets limp at their sides. And in the center of it all stood Juma, ledger in hand. He did not write. He simply watched. Because what could one write? About such a moment that the rain had reversed itself? That the world's rhythm had turned inside out for an afternoon? That puddles emptied and rooftops grew wet from underneath? Words seemed too small. Instead, Juma walked. He traced the paths the droplets took, how they floated from cracked stones, from coconut leaves, and from the curved bowls of sleeping cats. How they shimmered, then disappeared somewhere near the height of the oldest baobab tree. People began to murmur. Is it a sign? Of what? Something. Finishing, or something beginning. And then came the whispers, the kind that weave through tight alleys and around shuttered windows. Whispers about the ancestors. About a blessing. About the return of something long forgotten. Some said the rain was the sky reclaiming its memories. Others claimed it was a message that the town was waking up from a very long dream. Still others, quieter still, believed it was Juma who had caused it. Not on purpose, of course. No one suspected him of sorcery or mischief. But they had seen how the town's moods often mirrored the pages of his ledger. When he wrote of laughter, the markets felt lighter. When he scribbled worries, the sea grew restless. And once, when he accidentally spilled ink while copying a fisherman's joke, the tide had come in early and soaked every sandal left by the docks. But Juma had not written anything that morning, returned home that evening wet and silent. The rain had stopped rising sometime after sunset, evaporating into a violet sky streaked with copper. The sand was dry again, as if nothing had happened. He opened his ledger and paused. Then carefully he wrote, "The rain fell backwards, and no one asked why aloud." That was all. No date, no names. Just the fact, set down like a stone in shallow water. The next day, things resumed. Children kicked up dust. Merchants haggled over cinnamon bark. A stray goat was found asleep in the well. Everything felt quieter. Not sad, exactly. Just more aware. As if the town itself were listening harder. For the next few weeks, strange things continued. A woman woke to find sea glass arranged in a perfect spiral on her doorstep, no footprints nearby. A fisherman reported that his net came up, full of letters written in a language no one could read. A parrot began reciting verses from the Quran, though its owner had never taught it anything beyond curses. And each time, Juma wrote one line. The parrot speaks with someone else's voice. The glass spiral pointed inland. The letters have no owner, yet they carry meaning. He never offered an explanation, only observation. And slowly, the town settled into its new rhythm. It accepted the oddities the way a tree accepts wind as, part of the ongoing conversation with the world. But the backwards rain left a mark, deeper than most realized. For one, the coral began to change. Not quickly, but subtly. Builders noticed it first. The mortar felt different, softer, more reluctant to harden. Some walls began to shed tiny flakes at night, as if breathing in their sleep. A boy swore that one carved doorframe had shifted positions by morning just a few inches, but enough to scrape his shoulder where it hadn't the day before. And under the surface, beneath the waves, the reef itself pulsed with unfamiliar colors. Divers reported hues of blue they couldn't name. Fish moved in new patterns, as if tracing letters no one could yet read. Juma, ever quiet, said nothing, but he began to walk more often, not through town, but along the places people didn't. Go behind the ruined lighthouse, along the collapsed cistern, through the forgotten graveyard where the stones leaned like dozing birds. He carried no ledger, only a small pouch of sea salt and a bone whistle he never used. People noticed, of course. "He's listening for something," said Bibi Salma, now nearly blind. "What do you think he's heard?" asked her granddaughter. "Not what? Who?" And one night Juma vanished. No note. No sign of struggle. His house was untouched. The new ledger lay open on the table. The last line read, "Some things returned by leaving." He searched, half-heartedly. Not because they didn't care, but because some part of them knew this was not a disappearance, but a continuation. A fisherman claimed he saw Juma standing knee-deep in the surf just before dawn, humming to the tide. A child said she dreamt of him walking across the sky, barefoot on the clouds, leaving wet footprints that never dried. The coral mason said nothing but began carving his name into the lintels of every new building, just a single symbol small and nearly invisible where the door meets the frame. And the rain? It never fell backwards again. But once a year, on an unmarked Tuesday or Thursday or day betweened, a strange mist would rise not from the sea, but from the town itself. It carried no moisture. It's only a scent salt and ink and old wood. And for just a few minutes, everyone paused to listen, to remember, to wonder. Somewhere Juma's ledger remains. Not in a library or a museum, but in the coral, in the alleyways, in the soft hush that follows an unexpected silence. And if you ever visit that forgotten Swahili port town, if you stand beneath the almond tree and close your eyes, you might hear a voice murmur, "The rain fell backwards once." The town remembers. Write only one line, and make it true. In the waning days of the 10th century, in the city of Rathan, a thriving cultural hub nestled in the Persian heartlands, where caravans carried silk and scrolls in equal measure, most curious disagreement arose. It had nothing to do with war, taxes, or royal succession. No. Thrones teetered, no armies mobilized. The trouble began with a cucumber, specifically a cucumber preserved in vinegar and seasoned with dill, garlic, and a pinch of crushed coriander. Seed it was, according to the merchant who sold it in the market square, the most contemplative pickle in all of Persia. Now, this would have passed as harmless marketplace exaggeration had it not been overheard by one Abu Mansur al-Farjani, a minor philosopher of moderate repute and major appetite. Al-Farjani had been educated in knee shaper, was once accused of arguing with a garden statue for 3 days. He claimed it was a metaphor, and made a modest living teaching dialectics to impatient teenagers from merchant families. Upon hearing the phrase contemplative pickle, Al-Farjani reportedly paused mid-step and whispered to himself, "Can brine preserve thought?" He bought the pickle. He took it home, and thus began a philosophical unraveling that would, over the course of 2 seasons, consume the attention of poets, cooks, clerics, heretics, 2 donkeys, and 1 very influential librarian. For Al-Farjani did what philosophers often do when struck by inspiration. He wrote a treatise. It was titled "On the Potential of Fermentation to Encapsulate the Eternal Truths of the Cosmos." In it, he argued quite seriously that pickling, like philosophy, was a process of preservation. Just as reason clarified the soul and distilled wisdom from the raw chaos of human experience, so too did vinegar and salt extract the essence of a cucumber. Both were, in essence, alchemical. He posited that each pickle was a kind of edible epistle, a letter from nature preserved against the rot of time. The spices were punctuation, the crunch, a kind of ontological emphasis. He concluded with a flourish, and thus, "I say unto those who would separate cuisine from contemplation, you have not truly tasted the universe till you have eaten a pickled turnip in silence beneath a fig tree while considering the impermanence of figs." The treatise scoped by hand and shared with his students might have faded into obscurity had not one of them, a rather clever boy named Idris, snuck a copy to the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. There, it landed on the desk of Bahia al-Chatib, a scholar known for her expertise in logic, linguistics, and the culinary arts. Bahia had written extensively on the stuff, metaphysics of metaphor, and had once described a particularly good bowl of lentil soup as a sermon in saffron. She read the treatise thrice. Then, with the briskness of someone offended on both intellectual and gastronomic grounds, she composed a rebuttal on the absurdity of culinary epistemology and the limits of the pickled mind. Her central thesis was simple. Just because something is preserved does not mean it contains meaning. A date pit buried in resin is not a poem. A salted plum is not Plato. Fermentation, she claimed, is practical, not philosophical. Her tone, however, was not so kind. If cucumbers are philosophers, she wrote, then I dare not ask what soup would say. She sent the rebuttal too. Ray with the stamp of her seal and a note to be read aloud at the next public gathering of minds, mouths, or both. And so the debate began. The arrival of Bahia al-Khatib's rebuttal caused no small stir in Ray. The treatise was read aloud by a particularly theatrical apothecary named Omar, who relished the opportunity to perform the words of a woman renowned for both her wit and her withering tone. The marketplace, unusually crowded that morning due to the fig shipment from Kazvin, fell into a hush as Omar unfurled the scroll and began to equate a sour gourd with the sacred geometries of thought as to salt not only the vegetable, but also the very wellsprings of logic. Some in the crowd laughed. Others nodded solemnly, as if the truth had at last been ladled out in words sharper than vinegar. A few local chefs took offense, muttering that their craft was more art than alchemy and deserved better than to be dismissed as merely practical. Al-Farjani, upon hearing of the rebuttal, retired to his garden with a jar of pickled carrots and wrote his reply under the quince tree. He titled it In Defense of the Blind Soul, a response to the skepticism of Bahia al-Khatib. His writing, now increasingly flavored with sarcasm and spice, framed her argument as tragically literal. "Does not the date pit contain the tree?" he asked. "Is the seed not a scroll yet unread?" He reminded her and, by extension, the growing audience of philosophers, merchants, and curious children that many truths begin in the stomach. After all, had it not been hunger that shaped cities, empires, and the roots of trade? Were not spice is the reason for fleets, and salt's the reason for wars. To deny the pickle its place in philosophy is to deny the pomegranate its poetry. By now, a strange thing had happened. The townspeople of Ray had chosen sides. The bakers and apothecaries largely supported Al-Farjani, as did the students of rhetoric, who appreciated his lyrical flair and unconventional metaphors. Meanwhile, the mathematicians, bookbinders, and accountants aligned with Bahia, citing her discipline, clarity, and disdain for sentimental produce. There were arguments in tea-houses, friendly duels between rival poets, and at least one instance of a scholar being gently pelted with olives after referring to mustard seeds as existentially inert. Even the local imam was drawn into the dispute. During his Friday sermon, he observed with diplomatic neutrality, "Whether a pickle may teach us the order of the cosmos, I cannot say. But let us not confuse the sharpness of taste with the sharpness of truth. One satisfies the tongue, the other the soul." The debate spilled into unexpected places. At the city baths, bathers quoted passages from both philosophers while ladling water over their heads. In the market, sellers began advertising their pickles with tiny scrolls attached each with a brief quote from either Al-Farjani or Bahia, depending on their allegiance. A particularly entrepreneurial grocer offered a dialectical pickle platter with opposing flavor profiles meant to simulate a philosophical conversation. Customers would chew thoughtfully, then declare whether they found brine or spice to be the superior argument. Children played a game called Pickle or Parable. One player offered a strange phrase, and the others had to guess if it was a line from Al-Farjani's treatise or just a misheard proverb from a vegetable vendor. By winter, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad received letters from Ray requesting formal arbitration. Word had spread so far that even a few curious monks in Mount Lebanon copied the debate into their own archives. It's uncertain whether it was satire or profound commentary on the nature of meaning. And so it was that a simple phrase overheard in a Persian market had transformed into a cultural tremor. What had begun as a passing metaphor became a movement of sorts, a reminder that history is often shaped not just by generals and kings, but by thinkers who dare to compare the soul to a radish in brine. As the city of Ray awaited Bahia al-Khatib's next response, one question hovered in the winter air. Tucked like a folded note between scrolls and spices, can something as simple and sour as a pickle really preserve wisdom across the ages? It was a strange season in Ray. By the time the first spring winds unfurled, the plum blossoms. The great pickle debate as it had come to be known in whispered jest and handwritten. Marginalia had outgrown its original thinkers, no longer just the concern of Bahia al-Chatib or Al-Farjani the Elder. It had taken on a momentum of its own. Couriers from Shiraz arrived bearing copies of a new commentary on the digestive integrity of ideas by a young scholar named Ibn Masraq, who claimed that all logic could be better understood if one followed the metaphor of fermentation. Over time, he argued that thoughts like turnips in brine matured with quiet pressure and ought not be rushed, lest they sour in haste and rot under scrutiny. Meanwhile, a rival text from Herat, The Perils of Gastronomic Philosophy, warned that over-reliance on culinary metaphors risked corrupting the clarity of the dialectical method. Its author, a dry and methodical jurist named Nizam Arai, compared Al-Farjani's metaphors to vinegar poured into a fountain, clouding the waters with unnecessary flavor. Neither author had ever visited Ray. Still, both works were read with great attention by the city's scribes, scholars, and athletes, chismongers, who had begun adopting philosophical terms to describe their dairy goods. Wheels of goat cheese now came in logical and metaphysical varieties, and one aging wedge was proudly labeled column-infused. In the meantime, Bahia al-Chatib had not remained idle. New scroll, a clarification regarding vinegared. Reason and the nature of serious thought arrived with a wax seal shaped like a lemon wedge. It was immediately carried to the House of Reflection, a quiet chamber on the southern edge of Ray, where scholars gathered barefoot to recite and debate. Her tone in this text was cooler than before, like a librarian too tired to scold. She wrote, "To insist that every sour thing holds a truth is to forget that some things are spoiled, not seasoned." Bahia outlined a concern that had begun to trouble others as well, that the debate had left the boundaries of philosophy and become a kind of indulgent wordplay. She warned of theatrical thinkers, more interested in entertaining crowds than pursuing wisdom. She quoted Aristotle carefully, translated and closed with an elegant metaphor of her own. A thought is like fresh water drawn from a deep well. If you flavor it with fruit and honey, it becomes pleasant. But the deeper thirst is not quenched with sweetness. It requires clarity. Even her detractors admitted it was well argued. Even Al-Farjani, though he grumbled to a neighbor that her metaphors were becoming dangerously close to pickling themselves. Then, one fateful week, an invitation arrived from the court of Al-Mu'tamid, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. To many, this was more shocking than any vinegar-based rebuttal. It meant the debate had finally reached the ears of power. The Caliph, known for his patronage of scholars, poets, and chess players, had a curious mind and a famously ironic sense of humor. He had summoned Bahia al-Chatib and Al-Farjani to present their arguments at court, not in a trial or tribunal, but in what he called a symposium of the sour and the sublime. It was to take place in a shaded garden near the Tigris River. A small amphitheater would be prepared. The guests would include scholars from Kufa and Busra, a few wandering mystics, and the Caliph himself, reclining on cushions beneath an orange tree. In Ray, preparations were feverish. Al-Farjani insisted on traveling with several jars of his finest pickled eggplant for illustrative purposes, he claimed. Bahia packed only her scrolls, 2 of her students, and a folding stool she called her thinking chair. Journey to Baghdad took several weeks, winding past Zanjan and Hamadan through spring rains and blooming orchards, Along the way, travelers stopped them, eager to glimpse the minds behind the now famous writings. Children in distant villages called out, "Tell us the pickle story," and handed them dried figs in exchange. At long last they reached the caliph's garden. It was a quiet space, perfumed with myrtle and watered by small canals. Attendants, in silk robes, offered sweet tea and fresh dates. Doves cooed from the shade. The caliph greeted them with warm curiosity and a faint smile. "You have caused quite the commotion, my friends," he said. "Come argue, amuse me, and if you're lucky, enlighten me." The symposium began with Bahia, who stood with poise and read from her newest scroll, emphasizing the danger of reducing thought to metaphor. She argued that philosophy was not a flavor, but a structure, one that collapsed when mixed with whimsy. She ended with a firm sentence: "Let vinegar remain in the jar, and truth on the page." Al-Farjani stood next. He did not read from a scroll. Instead, he held up a small jar of pickled lemons. "Hey, Caliph," he said with a gentle smile, "taste this and tell me it does not carry a memory." He spoke of how flavor preserved more than just fruit. It preserved time, longing, and even ideas. He told the story of a grandmother who packed jars of pickles before a long journey so that her grandchildren would remember her smile with every sour bite. "Philosophy," he said, "must also be tasted. Otherwise it dries into dust." The caliph listened in silence. Then he dipped his fingers into the jar, tasted a slice of lemon, and nodded. "Sour," he said, "but memorable." The court erupted in gentle laughter, and the caliph waved both thinkers toward the shade. That evening, there was no clear winner. Bahia and Al-Farjani sat side by side, sharing roasted chickpeas and cooled melon. They debated the role of metaphor in dreams, and whether Aristotle would have enjoyed yogurt. The pickle debate, as it had come to be called across the caliphate, did not end in Baghdad. It evolved. Books were written in response. One was The Sour Soul, a treatise on emotional fermentation, a curious blend of psychology and culinary history. Another on brined rationality became popular in Cordoba for reasons no one quite understood. But the most lasting legacy of the debate was not scholarly. It was the habit, adopted in cities from Damascus to Nishapur, of ending philosophical discussions with the question, "And what would the pickles say?" Even centuries later, in forgotten corners of dusty libraries, monks and scribes copied phrases from the debate into the margins of their own works, small reminders that even the dullest things can become vessels of meaning. Still, one question lingered like the smell of garlic in a sealed jar. Did anyone, in the end, truly understand what Al-Farjani meant? Or was the pickle always just a pickle after all? Long after the caliph's garden had emptied, and the symposium, chairs were folded away like the wings of quiet birds. The strange saga of pickles and philosophy lingered in the minds of the learned. It lingered in strange ways. In the libraries of Kufa and Busra, junior scholars could be seen tucking vine leaves between the pages of their notebooks, not for eating, but as small tributes to the memory of the debate. In Nishapur, an eccentric cleric named Al-Qadi began teaching logic through kitchen analogies, opening each class with the question, "What is the salt content of your soul today?" Even in Cordoba, a traveling poet recited a version of the story where the pickled lemon became a metaphor for divine sorrow. No two versions of the tale agreed on what had actually been said in Baghdad, but all of them ended with a smile and a puzzled expression. And what of Bahia el-Chatib and Al-Farjani? They returned to Ray separately, but the city welcomed them like folk heroes. Students lined the streets with fennel fronds and offered notes inscribed with vinegar-stained ink. Somewhere in the back room of a candlelit tavern, a bard strummed a dusty oud and sang. A woman wrote a vinegared thought. A man replied with lemons caught, but in the end they shared a seat where sweet and sour wisdom meet. Ah ha ha. Ever composed, resumed her writing in a quieter tone. Her next manuscript on the structure of gentleness and discourse was less concerned with metaphor and more with method. She had seen how easily an idea could become distorted when too many people added their own seasoning. Her margins were lined with small asides. Was this what I meant, truly? Or has the flavor outpaced the fruit? Her voice had not softened, but it had deepened. she opened a modest school called the House of Clear Water, where students were encouraged to read slowly, to pause often, and to test each idea against both reason and kindness. She did not ban metaphors but insisted they be washed thoroughly before use. As for Al-Farjani the elder, he became somewhat of a legend. Children would follow him through the markets of Ray, hoping to hear a phrase like intellectual turmeric or logical brine. Merchants carved tiny pickle jars from walnut wood and sold them as charms for luck in exams. He, too, began writing again, less flamboyantly, perhaps, but with a warmth that suggested he had come to see the world not only as edible, but also as fragile. His final book, penned in old age, was titled The Salt of Memory. It was part memoir, part culinary diary, and part philosophical reflection. One passage in particular became widely quoted. Ideas must be preserved, not just expressed. The most beautiful thought, if left unattended, turns bitter. We must store them carefully in clean jars, sealed with truth, and labeled not with pride, but humility. In time, Bahia and Al-Farjani came to be regarded not just as thinkers, but as caretakers of a cultural moment. A debate that had begun with laughter and outlandish metaphor had gently unraveled into something gentler, a shared reminder of how easily intellect and emotion intertwine, like pomegranate seeds in a bowl of lentils. Centuries later, a monk in Armenia would discover a fragment of their writings pressed between the pages of a medical manual. He copied the line onto the wall of his cell. Sourness sharpens thought, but only sweetness endures. In a dusty village near Samarkand, a folk tale was told about two old friends who argued over pickles until they realized they were arguing about time, memory, and the soul. In Andalusia, a painting was discovered depicting two scholars, one holding a lemon, the other a scroll seated beneath a tree, their expressions gentle, curious, and faintly amused. No one could quite remember the names, but the story remained. And to this day, when an idea seems too strange to make sense or when a debate grows too sour to continue, there are some who smile quietly and ask the ancient, peculiar question. What would the pickles say? The air was always thickest in the hour before dawn. Somewhere in the folds of the English countryside, far from battlefields, kings or cathedrals, a woman named Maud shuffled barefoot through the dew-damped grass. She carried a bundle of dried heather in one hand and a smudge pot of mossy smoke. In the other, her task was not prayer, nor plow, nor parchment. Her task was bees, not royal bees, not the bees kept in glass for curious monks or foreign princes. Just the working bees of Thorncombe Holofat, golden-bellied insects that whirred softly beneath straw skeps shaped like upturned baskets. The kind of bees whose honey was spooned into porridge, spread across barley bread, or mixed into mead. To quiet a winter fever, and though Maud was no noble, and her fingers were cracked and sticky with wax, there were whispers that she knew more about bees than any man in Dorset. Not that she'd say so aloud. In the year of our Lord 1376, to be a beekeeper was to be a little strange. The villagers didn't say it plainly, but they watched the apiarists closely. There was something off about people who spent so much time among stinging creatures without ever being stung. Some said Maud hummed in the same pitch as the hive. Others claimed her breath smelled faintly of blossoms year-round, even in snow. But the truth was quieter than gossip. Beekeeping, like most things in medieval life, was a trade passed down not through books, but through fingers, breath, and waiting. Maud had learned it from her grandmother, who had learned it from a hedge priest's wife, who had learned it from no one at all. Some said she'd just watched long enough. Bees, after all, are creatures of watching. They see patterns. Taste wind, they remember faces, and they demand silence. The hum of the past, unlike pigs or chickens or cows, bees were never really domesticated. They were invited humbly and always with caution. The medieval skep, a dome of coiled straw sealed with cow dung and clay, looked simple enough. But each one was a miniature kingdom, a wild republic of wings, governed not by words, but by sense, vibrations, and unspoken treaties. Maud kept 27 of them. Each skep had a name carved in chalk along its base: Thistle, Candle, St. Dorothea, Applewick, and Little Bealoud Glen. Some she'd inherited, others she'd built herself, knees sore, plaiting rushes by firelight. She did not name them for fun. Naming was a kind of pact. When a skep died, when the bees inside vanished or perished, Maud covered it with black wool and sat beside it, as one would a person. She sang for the hive, not a hymn, but a tune so old it had no words, just a low melody that wandered like a moth in torchlight, because you had to tell the bees. That was the rule. You had to tell them if someone had died, if someone had married, or if a baby had been born. If you didn't, the bees might leave, or worse, go mad and begin to spin strange combs that tasted of ash. In 14th century England, there were no official bee manuals. There were no guilds, no PayPal bulls on beekeeping, and no saints with hives embroidered on their robes. What existed instead was a web of half-remembered customs, scraps of Latin wisdom, and deep local knowledge. And in the thick of it stood people like Maud, people who knew how to coax wax from dark places, people who knew that bees did not just make honey, they made sense of things. Beekeepers and belief beekeepers, it turns out, occupied a curious rung on the medieval ladder of professions. They were not quite peasants, because bees were valuable. A single pound of beeswax could be traded for wool or grain. Monasteries used wax to make candles, which were essential for prayer. Nobles used honey in syrups and preserves, and in winter, mead was sometimes the only drink that stayed warm. But they were not quite artisans either. They had no tools to speak of, no shop, and no apprentices bustling about. Most didn't even work in town. Beekeepers lived on the edge of fields, of villages, of categories. They were, in a sense, wild by proximity, and so superstitions clung to them like burrs. Some swore beekeepers could curse a man's tongue with silence by hiding a dead queen bee in his shoe. Others claimed a beekeeper's shadow could charm fruit trees into blossom. Maud had heard them all. She neither confirmed nor denied. She simply kept her bees. Tools of the trade, a medieval beekeeper's equipment, was more spiritual than material. There was no veil, no gloves, just a linen smock, a smoky pot, a curved knife for cutting honeycomb, and an uncanny patience. Smoke was essential. To harm the bees, but to remind them of fire and ancient instinct that made them drowsy and distracted. Maud burned moss and nettle stalks, which smoldered slowly and bitterly. She carried the pot low, letting the smoke drift up like incense, her breath steady as a monk at matins. Then she'd lift the skep gently, tilting it to listen for the tone. Bees had tones. A happy hive hummed in B-flat. An anxious one thrummed higher, like a plucked harp string. A sick hive fell almost silent. Maud listened before she ever touched the comb. Her fingers moved like someone remembering a lullaby, soft, deliberate, never greedy. If she found brood bee larvae, she left it. If she found capped honey, she cut only a little, leaving enough for winter. Of queens and swarms in spring, the hives swarmed. That was both the danger and the hope. A swarm meant the bees were thriving, so much so that a new queen had been born, and the old one would soon depart with half the hive. The sky would darken with 1,000 bees, a living cloud that pulsed and shimmered like thought made visible. It was Maud's job to follow. She trailed the swarm on foot, calling softly, holding out a skep rubbed with thyme and honey. Sometimes the swarm would settle in a tree. Other times they vanished entirely off to the woods or to someone else's orchard. She never chased too far. "A bee that doesn't want you," her grandmother once said, "will not be kept." And so she let them go. Maud's life, like that of the hive, was not grand. It did not appear in chronicles or sermons or epics, but it thrummed with its own quiet order. She harvested honey in August, rendered wax in October, mended skeps in February, and welcomed new swarms in May. No one painted her. No abbey recorded her name. But the candles she helped make might have flickered in a king's chapel. Now the honey she jarred might have soothed a fevered night. and the bees she loved? They lived on long after her, in a dozen hives on 100 hedgerows. Buzzing their slow, secret songs into the mossy air, people sometimes came to Maud in winter. Not many, but enough. They came with cracked combs, dead queens, or worse hives. Gone quiet, they knocked politely, waited in the cold, and when Maud opened the door, they always stood a little too far back, as if afraid the bees might follow her out. She understood bees were both gift and threat. In some villages, it was believed that if a beekeeper died without telling the bees, the hives would fall into mourning. They'd refuse to make honey, or worse, they'd die themselves. Some tales claimed that bees would rise in a fury and sting every member of the household one by one until they too were gone. A superstition, maybe, but one that no serious beekeeper dared ignore. Maud had once walked 3 miles to a friend's cottage after hearing he'd passed away. She leaned into each skep-on, his land, her voice low and trembling in the morning fog. "John is gone. He won't be tending you this year. But we'll see to you, don't worry. Sleep well now." It wasn't magic. It was courtesy. And in medieval England, courtesy mattered. Far more than people remembered. A wax economy, though, honey, was sweet. It was wax that paid. The church needed beeswax for candles, lots of them. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, burned with smoke and stink, unsuitable for sacred places. But beeswax burned clean, gold bright, and steady. Maud set aside the darkest honeycombs. These were old brood combs, dark from use, often heavy with propolis and residue. She melted them in a wide cauldron, skimming the top, letting the wax rise. Was a pale yellow brick, still warm to the touch, which she wrapped in linen and carried to the market 3 towns over. Wax fetched a better price than honey, especially if it smelled faintly of thyme. Maud's did. She never said why. The apiaria's universe, a medieval beekeeper didn't study bees in the way monks studied stars or lawyers studied laws. There was no grand theory of apiary behavior, no formal names for species or subcastes. And yet, there was understanding. A kind of folk science passed in scraps, that bees preferred skeps placed eastward, so they warmed sooner in the day. That planting lavender nearby kept wasps away. Too much wind made a hive anxious, and too little made it prone to fungus. That the best queens were born in silence. Maud followed these patterns, not because she'd read them, but because her body had learned them. The way her knees felt in April told her how deep to bury the skep legs. The taste of the early nettle bloom warned her of a late frost. There was something in her gait, in the rhythm of her chores, that matched the hive. And maybe that was why the bees stayed. Royal bees and peasant bees in London, there were bees kept in glass grand, controlled hives maintained by monks and noble households. Their scribes made notes in Latin, tracking yields and deaths with precise little charts. A hive could be catalogued like a herd or a vineyard, but these were exceptions. For most of England, bees lived in straw, in wood, and in wildness. Some were caught from the forest. Others were stolen from abandoned chapels, their walls humming with unseen wings. Beekeepers like Maud didn't own the bees, they hosted them. And with that hosting came a kind of spiritual burden. If bees thrived, it was seen as a sign of blessing. If they died, it meant something had gone wrong within the land, the house, or the soul. So Maud paid attention, not just to combs and drones, but 2 things others missed. The curl of smoke near the church roof, sudden absence of frogs in the creek, a patch of herbs refusing to grow. Everything was connected. Bees taught her that. Rituals of the hive each year on Candlemas, Maud brought 2 bricks of wax too. The small chapel at Thorncombe. The priest accepted them with a nod. No words, just that. Everyone knew they were from her. And the villagers always noticed that the candles burned longer on those days. Longer and warmer somehow. At Easter, she gifted honey to the nuns. At Michaelmas, she gave jars to the old and the ill. Not because she had extra shit, often didn't, but because to keep bees was to be in balance, and balance meant giving. The bees took nectar and gave sweetness. She followed suit. Spring did not announce itself with fanfare. It crept in quietly. a longer trickle from the eaves, a frog's sudden chirp, a smell like thawed mud and greening things. Maud felt it first in her hands, which stopped cracking. Then in the bees. They did not burst from the skeps. No. They tested the world with a single scout, then two, a few loops. In the warming air. Then a full-bodied hum. They remembered the world. And Maud, too, remembered herself. Not the silent winter watcher, but the keeper again. The steward. The one who opened each hive like a priest, lifting a veil. She did not wear gloves. She did not veil her face. Some said this was foolish. Others called it trust. She simply said it was necessary. Bees knew fear. They smelled it and tasted it, and fear made them restless. So she kept her heart still, like drawing water from a deep, calm well. The hive mind and the human mind people said bees had a queen. But Maud never liked that word. A queen suggested power, decision, and decree. The bee at the center of the hive did not command, it existed. She exuded purpose, yes, but not dominance. The hive served her, but not like subjects. It was more like breath serves a body, which be moved for the whole. And in this, Maud found comfort. Her own life, so solitary and quiet, was part of something larger. Not family, not village, but rhythm. The rhythm of the hives, of course, but also the land. The seasons, the pull of the moon, the turn of roots under soil. Some days, she felt she was made of wax and wind herself, custodian of golden silence. A death in the hives that spring, one of Maud's oldest skeps fell still. It had stood near the hazel trees for over 9 years. A strong hive, dark honey, thick combs, and bees gentle even in summer. But now, there was only silence. She opened the lid slowly. Inside, the bodies of thousands, perfect, still unspoiled. No sign of disease, no predator, just stillness. She sat by the skep for an hour. Not mourning exactly. Bees die. Something about this stillness felt final, like a bell that had rung too long. Then she sang. A soft, broken melody. The one her mother had sung when their first hive died. The words didn't matter. The tune didn't matter. It was the intention that counted. After, she buried the comb in a hollow near the stream, under stones and moss. The wax would feed the land. The memory would feed her. Not everything must be kept. Some things are for releasing. Guest and ghosts in her later years, Maud became something of a legend. Children whispered about the bee woman of Thorncombe. They said her bees could speak, that they brought her gossip from village to village, that she could call a swarm with her breath. Once a friar from the city came to interview her. He wrote down her answers in a little book and furrowed his brow when she spoke of songs and wind and balance. Wanted precise answers. How many eggs does a queen lay per day? Maud shrugged. As many as she needs. He left disappointed. But the bees stayed. That was the real record. A quiet ending. When Maud passed, there was no grand ceremony. The villagers found her in her garden, face turned to the sun, a half-finished honeycomb in her lap. They told the bees, of course. Each skep was tapped 3 times, then 3 again. Your keeper is gone, they said, but you are not forgotten. That year, the honey was unusually dark like burnt gold, dense, with a flavor like rosemary and thunder. Yes. People said it was her last gift. Others said it was just the weather. Maud would have smiled at both ideas. The wisdom in straw long after her name was lost to time. Maud's skeps remained. Not hers, exactly, but ones like them. Straw domes, carefully stitched, bees humming inside. Keepers still humming outside. Somewhere in the echo of the hive, her knowledge lingered, in the way a beekeeper tilts a skep just so. In this way, honey is offered before it is taken. In the way a child stops and listens to the low hum in a hedgerow, Maud was gone. But the bees kept the rhythm, and the rhythm, in turn, kept the world. If you were to walk the stretch of East Africa's coastline just before dawn where the sky is indigo and the tide laps with a sleepy pulse, you might find yourself tracing the outline of a ghost town. It wouldn't announce itself with monuments or grand ruins. If you'd notice the quiet first, then the shapes. Half-swallowed walls of coral rag stone, mangled door frames carved with floral spirals, and broken staircases leading nowhere. Beneath your feet, pieces of Chinese porcelain and Persian glass would crunch softly, tangled in the roots of fig trees reclaiming their ancestral homes. You are in Kilwa Kisiwani, or perhaps Gid, or Shanga, three names, but one story. Is a forgotten Swahili port town, born of monsoons and trade winds, raised on cinnamon and whispers, and silenced by the quiet economics of time. In its day between the 9th and 16th centuries, this coast hummed with movement. Swahili towns were not backwaters. They were polished jewels in the maritime web that stretched from Sofala to Gujarat and Aden to Malacca. And unlike so many ancient ruins cast in shades of conquest or empire, these were towns of conversation between Africans and Arabs, Persians and Portuguese, and Indians and Indonesians. Swahili culture wasn't imposed, it was brewed. Imagine a place where the call to prayer echoed alongside the call of the market, where ivory tusks leaned beside bundles of dried fish, and Arabic script danced across coconut leaf manuscripts detailing both Quranic verses and Tao repair techniques. Yet today, when most think of the great trading centers of the ancient world, their minds drift eastward to China or west to Venice. The Swahili world remains an afterthought, a soft outline on the historical map. And so we begin, not with a bang, but a breeze the monsoon wind. In fact, what it was this seasonal rhythm, this predictability of nature's breath that gave birth to an entire way of life. Twice a year, the winds shifted. The Kiskazi blew south from Arabia between November and March. The Kuzi returned north from Mozambique from April to September. These winds weren't just weather, they were timetables. They told the fishermen when to anchor. They told the traders when to set sail. And they told the city-states when to prepare for guests. You might imagine the coastline during one of these seasonal changes. The harbor would stir before the sun, with porters rubbing sleep from their eyes, and muezzins drawing deep breaths. To summon the faithful, sailors, hardened by months at sea, would haul crates of glazed ceramics and damask cloth down gangplanks slick with dew. The scent of cardamom mingled with the smell of seaweed, palm oil, and distant smoke. At the dock, children with shaved heads and long shirts would trail behind elders to see what goods had arrived. Somewhere, a nobleman with coral-white prayer. Beads would be preparing his finest Swahili Arabic, and maybe a smattering of Farsi to entertain the newcomers. The languages blended like spices in a stew. Everyone knew a little of everyone else's tongue. The houses, meanwhile, waited like quiet witnesses, built of coral limestone, carved from the very reefs that lined the coast. They stayed cool in the sun and stood proud against the storms. Narrow streets wound like thoughtful conversations between their walls, offering pockets of shade and sudden bursts of laughter. At night, oil lamps flickered through Mashrabia-style lattice windows, casting patterned light onto stone floors smoothed by centuries of footsteps. And yet, these places were not cities in the sense you might expect. They were small sometimes, no more than a few thousand residents, but dense with beauty. They were ruled by local sultans, often of mixed ancestry, who wore imported silk robes while discussing the price of tortoiseshell, the latest news from Mecca. They had mosques with coral pillars, some of which still stand, defying rain and rot. Swahili, the language, was and remains a Bantu tongue. Yet you would find it laced with Arabic, Persian, Hindi, and later Portuguese. It was a language of adaptation, of hospitality. In it, even greetings were gentle. Huyambo, are you? Well, and the response, simple and firm. Sai Jambo, I am well. But the Swahili world wasn't merely a place of trade. It was a place of writing and memory. Yes, many histories were oral, passed in song and parable. But there were also scribes, men with calloused fingers and ink-stained robes, writing poetry about love, loss, and longing for the prophet, their pens scratching across pages of tanned hide or imported paper. Perhaps you would have met one, sitting cross-legged in a shaded courtyard. A scribe might tell you, in a low and steady voice, about a man named Abu Bakr, who once sailed to Hormuz and returned with not only spices but also a Persian wife and a fondness for saffron in his morning porridge. He might tell you how the women of the town wore kanga cloth printed with proverb sayings like, "Patience is a tree with bitter roots, but sweet fruit." Their beauty rituals included clove oil and henna, and on moonlit nights you could hear their laughter carried on the wind like the chiming of bells. And yet, for all this vibrant life, these towns were already practicing a kind of elegant disappearance. The Swahili had a term kushihini to describe the idea of fullness, or completeness, but also of letting go. Their towns were never fixed capitals. They moved, migrated, dissolved, and reformed with the tides and winds, adapting like the dhows that skimmed across the sea. Kilwa was once so rich it minted its own gold coins. Today it lies scattered in ruins, vines draped like lace across crumbling archways. Gid, hidden in the Kenyan forest, is filled with baobabs and bats, the only sentinels of its lost grandeur. And Shanga, buried under sand and silence, whispers only to the archaeologists who brush its bones with careful hands. But what caused the decline? That question, gentle but persistent, sits at the edge of every broken coral wall and every buried potsherd. Was it the Portuguese? The collapse of trade routes? Shifting monsoons? Internal rivalries? Or did the Swahili simply follow their own logic of impermanence, moving inland or blending into newer settlements? The truth is likely all of these and none. The Swahili towns do not lend themselves to singular narratives. They are a mosaic, like their courtyards, small tiles of different colors, telling stories and patterns you must slow down to see. And perhaps that is what they offer us, no an invitation to slow down, to walk the narrow paths where merchants once debated the price of ambergris, to sit in the shade where poets once composed verse about mangoes and moonlight, listen to a wind that still speaks Swahili, if you know how to hear it. And so, as we rest in the cool quiet of this long-forgotten town, one final question drifts on the salt-tinged air. If history forgets a city built on conversation, does the silence that follows carry its memory or erase it? The forgotten towns along the Swahili coast did not leave behind blueprints in the way Roman cities or Chinese capitals did. 8. There were no rigid street grids or grand plazas set to imperial standards. Instead, their maps were ones you felt with your feet and your nose. A city planned not by rulers and compasses but by wind, shade, trade, and smell. If you could step back into one of these port towns at its height, say Kilwa Kiziwanian, the 14th century, you would not find wide boulevards or soaring monuments. You would find narrow alleys, just wide enough for 2 donkeys to pass side by side, each packed with bundles of dried fish or cloth. You'd hear the bells tied around, their necks jingling with a rhythm as ancient as the tides. Each turn in the street brought a change in temperature and scent. Some alleyways were cool and dark, draped in shadow by coral stone homes whose walls were built thick to hold in the ocean breeze. Others opened suddenly to sunlit courtyards bursting with bougainvillea and bright-hued laundry strung across wooden beams. But it was the smell that marked the true boundaries of the town. The markets were oceans of fragrance. There was the temps of dried lemongrass and the sweet, sharp perfume of ground cloves. There was the rich scent of tamarind pulp stored in clay jars and the fishy, smoky note of octopus being grilled on iron grates over open flame. From Yemen came frankincense and myrrh, resinous and sticky in the morning sun. From India, pepper and cardamom, wrapped in oiled cloth to preserve their bite. From the forests inland, camphor, bark, and wild honey were carried in carved wooden boxes on the backs of Swahili traders who knew every twist in the forest paths like a sailor knows the stars. There was no single market center, no dominant bazaar. Rather, the whole town was a mosaic of micro-markets. A woman with her kanga spread on the ground, selling baobab fruit and green bananas. A man with one leg who traded tiny parcels of blue Chinese porcelain for copper wire. An old herbalist whose mortar and pestle had long since worn smooth from grinding ginger root. And then there were the scents of life not meant for sale. The Sea breeze pushing through open shutters, scented with seaweed and sun-warmed coral. The charcoal smoke from morning cook fires, and the sharp temps of lime squeezed over freshly caught crab. But the Swahili towns were not only places of trade. In aroma, they were also architectural poems. Their buildings spoke in geometry and light. The houses known as Nyumba Ma, or stone houses, were unlike anything in Europe or Asia, made from coral limestone and mortared with lime. They had intricate facades with recessed arches, lattice screens, and doors carved with geometric and floral designs. The doors themselves were marvels. Some bore inscriptions, verses from the Quran, names of owners, or protective invocations. Others were decorated with iron studs, not just for beauty but to signify status and possibly to deter spirits. Step inside one of these homes and you would pass through a carved threshold into a cool vestibule. A few steps further and you'd enter the inner courtyard, where a small garden, perhaps just a few potted herbs, sat beside a stone water basin for washing hands before meals. Rooms were arranged not in rows, but in clusters, creating both openness and privacy, especially for the women of the household. There were niches in the walls for lamps and niches for books. One wall might be lined with shelves of blue-glazed bowls and Chinese celadon plates, displayed not as wealth, but as memory piece, a story of a journey, a visitor, or a season. Above it all rose the minaret of the town's mosques, mall, square and practical. The call to prayer was not amplified by electronics, but carried on the backs of the wind. 5 times a day, men in white robes gathered in quiet rows, placing their foreheads gently on mats woven from palm fronds. Education flourished here too, though it did not announce itself in grand universities. Instead, children gathered in Dugsy schools, sitting in circles around an elder, memorizing the Quran letter by letter. They used Lois flat wooden tablets, in which they wrote with ink made of soot and gum. When the lesson was done, they washed the lotus clean and began. Again, for the sons of wealthy merchants, learning went beyond religion. They studied the stars, not just for beauty, but because navigation was life. The names of constellations passed from Persian to Arabic to Swahili, sometimes changing pronunciation, sometimes changing meaning. The sea, after all, had its own language. Many of these towns even had libraries, modest perhaps by the standards of Baghdad or Timbuktu, filled with scrolls and manuscripts. Some were religious treatises, others medical texts. Some were poems that compared the fragrance of cloves to the breath of a beloved. Knowledge moved here just as goods did. Women were not invisible in this world either. Though veiled in public, they were central to home life and commerce. They managed households, arranged marriages, preserved oral histories, and sometimes even ran small businesses. A widow might inherit a portion of her husband's trading network. A matron might own a spice stall passed down for generations. Clothing was modest but expressive. Men wore long robes kansasand, small caps called kofia, embroidered with delicate patterns. Women's garments flowed like water, layered in bright colors and adorned with jewelry of silver or amber. A bride's wedding outfit might include ankle bells, glass beads from Venice, and a veil perfumed with jasmine oil. And then there was music. The towns pulsed with rhythm. The ngoma drumbeat echoed through alleyways during weddings, births, and holy days. The tarab, music born of Arab, Indian, and African melodies, told stories of love and longing. On warm nights, neighbors would gather on rooftops to sing under the stars, the sound rising like incense into the night sky. It was a world not built for eternity, but for harmony with the sea, with the land, with the seasons. The Swahili did not leave behind pyramids or cathedrals. Instead, they left behind fragments of a lived poetry, bits of porcelain, lines of verse, doorways opening onto courtyards, now filled with sand and silence. And yet there is a quiet defiance in these ruins. Despite centuries of neglect, their coral stones still hold warmth at dusk. Despite vines and salt and time, their staircases still lead upward, as if someone might return at any moment to climb them. You might sit there on one such stair and close your eyes. the wind would brush your cheek like a whisper. And if you listened closely, you might hear the market rising again, call to prayer threading through the air, and the laughter of children echoing faintly from behind a carved door. This was not a forgotten world. It was simply one that waited, patient and unhurried, to be remembered. If you walk through the remains of a Swahili port town today, perhaps along the time-worn alleys of Gede, the tidal reach of Kilwa, or the salt-crusted stones of Lemoy, might be surprised by how much of the town still lingers in the air. Long after the people are gone, the ruins don't rise grandly like European castles or Roman forums. They do not seek to impress. Instead, they crouch close to the ground, intimate and half-consumed by the jungle. Trees grow where living rooms once stood. Mangroves drink from ancient wells. Blue lizards scurry across staircases that once bore the embroidered sandals of merchant princes. Time has been kind and unkind in equal measure. Some coral walls still bear the traces of lime plaster, pale and smooth to the touch. At a certain angle of the sun, you might glimpse the curve of a window frame or the softened lines of a carved door. Here and there, a ceiling beam remains, petrified into stone. And sometimes amid the ruins, a date palm still grows, its roots deep in what was once a courtyard garden. These towns did not fall all at once. Their decline was like a tide pulling back, slow, steady, and almost unnoticeable. There were no great wars that leveled them, no single catastrophe. It was the shifting sands of trade, politics, and power. When Portuguese ships first appeared on the Swahili coast in the late 15th century, they brought cannons and arrogance. Portuguese viewed these city-states not as peers, but as obstacles, waypoints to control. They burned, plundered, and imposed their authority with sharp steel and stone forts. But they also misunderstood what they were dealing with. They thought these towns were poor because they didn't build in marble or gold. They missed the quiet wealth stored in Chinese porcelain, in libraries of poetry, and in the scent of cloves. Traded for centuries, they didn't know how to hear the rhythm of Swahili life, which beat to a gentler tidal clock. The Omani Arabs followed in the centuries to come, building new forts and reasserting Muslim influence. The language of governance changed. New sultans were crowned. But the old ways, the whispering ways, faded, little by little. Trade routes shifted inland and northward. New ports like Mombasa and Zanzibar flourished, drawing business away from the smaller, older towns. Storms buried harbors in silt. The sea pulled back. Coral block homes were abandoned, their roofs collapsing under monsoon rains. The goats returned, so did the vines. And yet something always remained. In some places, the descendants of those ancient towns still live nearby, farming cassava or weaving mats from palm fronds. Elders tell stories of grandfathers who once recited Persian verses, of uncles who could smell cinnamon from across a bay, and of great aunts whose wedding necklaces were said to contain a bead from every continent. In Lamu and Pate and Shela, in towns that never fully died, the Swahili spirit hums on, softer now, like a lullaby. You can still hear it in the call to prayer that echoes from slender minarets. You can taste it in the tamarind fish curry and the coconut rice steamed in banana leaves. You can see it in the arch of a doorway, the twist of a dow's sail, and the delicate stitch of a kikoi cloth catching sunlight in a sea breeze. Even in full ruin, the architecture speaks. Those thick coral walls built to withstand both time and tide tell us that the builders knew they were part of something larger. They were not trying to defeat nature, they were trying to live with it, to shape their homes around wind and water, not against it. And there is a kind of peace in that. Some anthropologists have tried to reconstruct what life might have looked like on an ordinary Tuesday in a town like Kilwa or Shanga. No grand processions, no invading ships. Just life. A boy racing a hoop down an alley, a woman preparing dough for chapati, an old man sitting in the shade, grinding dried hibiscus petals into tea. Perhaps, in the afternoon, a dhow would arrive from India, its sails spotted long before. It docked. Merchants would gather near the beach, calculating what to trade and who to greet first. The arrival of a ship was not just business, it was news, excitement, and renewal. The town's rhythm quickened with every new sail. And at night the rhythm slowed again. The stars would rise over the sea. The moon would reflect in still water, gathered in a courtyard basin. Children would be told stories of talking birds, of clever fishermen, of magic rings found in oysters. These tales were not just for fun, they were memory, coded in rhythm, and repetition designed to outlast time. Even now you can hear the echo of those stories in the way elders speak. In the lull between waves on a quiet night, and in the scrape of a broom on coral stone streets, sometimes history is loud. But the Swahili coast teaches us that history can also be gentle. It can be made not with cannons and columns, but with laughter, patience, and the slow layering of trade, faith, and friendship. It can be made with spice and song, and maybe, just maybe, that is the kind of history most worth remembering. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that whispers. Not the kind carved into mountains, but the kind that floats on salt air. So the next time you find yourself near the sea, pause. Breathe in. There, do you smell the cardamom? Do you hear the soft creak of a dhow? Do you feel the warm stone beneath your feet? You may not see them, but the Swahili towns are still there, whispering. Just beneath the waves, waiting to be remembered. You're lying on your side in a candlelit room, the scent of melting beeswax thick in the air. Before you is a table oak, hand-hewn, steady despite its age. Upon it rests a vellum map, unrolled with great care. The ink is just beginning to dry. You are a mapmaker's apprentice in Antwerp, sometime in the 1570s, and you've spent the last 3 hours carefully etching waves into an ocean no one you know has ever seen. That ocean, the mare incognitum, the unknown sea, you're not expected to know what's really out there. In fact, no one does. And that, curiously, is your opportunity. Your master has been snoring gently in the corner for over an hour now, his feathered cap falling lower with each wheezing breath. You glance over, then back at the wide swath of empty blue stretching between the coast of West Africa and the blurred line that claims to be Brasilia. Your quill hovers, tempted. There is room here, you think. And so you begin to draw a sea. Monster. Before Google Earth, before satellites, before standardized longitude, the world was guessed at with remarkable confidence, embellished with remarkable flair. The maps of the 15th to 17th centuries, particularly those produced in Europe, are not merely navigational tools. They are part scientific instrument, part theological speculation, and part artistic doodle pad. The oceans were especially problematic. Land masses, even when misproportioned, could be built from word of mouth and merchant gossip. Oceans were empty. Empty. Narratively empty. And to the early European mind, that simply would not do. Enter the marginalia. The marginalia of early atlases and Portolan charts, the illustrations in the margins or in the vast, watery gaps became one of the oddest art forms in Renaissance Europe. Some maps feature whales the size of Ireland. Others, unicorns galloping across deserts. There are cherubs blowing winds, lions sunbathing on mountain peaks, and even medieval nudists frolicking near the Amazon. Then there are the dragons. The Latin phrase here, bedragons, is famously associated with old maps, though it appears on only one known surviving globe, the Lennox globe. C. 1503-207. The actual phrase inscribed was HICSVNT Dracones. Written along the east coast of Asia, the symbolism was straightforward, if fantastical. The unknown parts of the world were considered dangerous by default. And what better shorthand for proceed with caution than a fire-breathing lizard?
Albad.
But it wasn't just about danger. The dragons, krakens, and sea serpents also reflected a human compulsion to decorate the unknown. To understand why this happened, one must understand the context in which these maps were produced. Europe was entering its so-called age of discovery, a period where exploration, colonialism, commerce, and Christian evangelism were intertwined. Maps served many functions. They helped ships navigate, impressed investors and patrons, and symbolized political power. But for the people actually making them, many of whom worked in cramped workshops far from the sea, maps were also puzzles and canvases. Imagine you are a cartographer for the Dutch East India Company. You've been given partial data scribbled notes from sailors, third-hand tales from spice merchants, and crude outlines from older maps. You're expected to produce a definitive image of Sumatra by Tuesday. What do you do with the parts no one can quite agree on? What goes in the blank spaces? Well, you get creative. Some added giant birds. Others illustrated indigenous people, often imagined or stylized, lounging under banana trees. A few, perhaps out of sheer boredom, added ships mid-battle, or Neptune himself emerging from the waves. In some cases, these flourishes were a quiet rebellion, a way to reclaim a moment of artistic freedom in what was otherwise deeply constrained work. A cartographer might have had strict guidelines from patrons, but no one could dictate exactly how the wind god should look, or how curly the kraken's tentacles must be. One particularly fascinating example is Alazes Magnus's Carta Marina, printed in 1539. Magnus, Swedish ecclesiastic and scholar, spent 12 years compiling a map of the Nordic countries. It spans more than 5 feet in width and is filled with elaborate illustrations, more than 180 in total. In the North Atlantic, a gigantic red sea serpent coils ominously. Elsewhere, a whale sprays a boat out of the sea. Near Iceland, men fish through holes in the ice, while polar bears amble nearby. Were these images meant to be taken literally? Perhaps partially? They drew from sailors' tales and folklore, but they also served to fill the uncomfortable silence of not knowing. In doing so, they reassured the viewer. Yes, there is something out there. It might be dangerous, but it has a face. Story. The unknown becomes bearable when it is illustrated. Map-making was not just an art or a science, it was an exercise in cultural imagination. When early European map-makers drew lions in West Africa or horned beasts in the East Indies, they weren't just filling space, they were expressing the boundaries of their worldviews. Even the inclusion of windheads, those chubby-cheeked cherubs, puffing air from the corners of maps, was symbolic. They weren't just decorative. They represented classical personifications of the four winds, borrowed from ancient Greco-Roman geography. In a way, they acted like cosmic compasses, guiding travelers not just through space, but through myth. One might say the entire enterprise of cartography in this era was mythographic. But unlike myths carved in stone, these were myths in motion, updated. With each voyage, each new tale from abroad, each half-remembered port, the monsters shifted. The coastlines bent. But the impulse to decorate the unknown, that stayed remarkably steady. As you imagine yourself tracing coastlines with a quill in a dimly lit studio, it's worth asking, what did it feel like to be a map maker surrounded by uncertainty? Was it frustrating? Or was it liberating? Was the dragon a warning or a flourish? And most of all, what happens when the real world finally arrives to replace the imagined one? What becomes of the sea monster? Picture an enormous wooden globe in the corner of a Renaissance study, spinning ever so slowly by candlelight. Its oceans ripple with hand-painted waves. The continents are tinged in ochre and vermilion, and here and there floating in vast blue seas are creatures that do not exist. A winged seahorse near Sumatra, a fish with the head of a lion near Greenland, a horned serpent twined through the Indian Ocean. To the untrained eye, these might seem like innocent flourishes, the equivalent of doodles in the margins of a bored scholar's notebook. But in fact, these fantastical creatures had layers of meaning. They weren't just art, they were arguments about danger, dominion, and divine order. Because in the early modern world, the unknown wasn't merely unknown, it was suspect. Unmapped territories suggested savagery. Unseen oceans invited speculation. And speculation, in turn, made it possible to imagine conquest as a necessity. Let's unravel this quiet truth slowly. In 1570, a Flemish cartographer named Abraham Ortelius published what is now considered the first modern atlas, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum Theater of the World. Its maps were not just accurate for their time, they were beautiful. Gracefully rendered coastlines, elegantly lettered place names, and yes, occasional sea monsters curling in darkened waters. Ortelius's maps were, above all, meant to impress. He knew his audience: merchants, noble patrons, scholars, and princes. Each map needed to be a performance, something one could roll out with a flourish and discuss over wine. The monsters played their role well. They weren't placed randomly. Some curled around contested waters like the Arctic or along the fringes of the southern hemisphere. In places where Europe's knowledge faded, serpents coiled and leviathans stirred. These creatures served as elegant metaphors, not just for danger, but for opportunity. Here be dragons could just as easily mean here be riches. If the sea was treacherous, after all, it justified the risks taken to tame it. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the maps of the Portuguese and Spanish empires. Their maps, which were often secretive and closely guarded, rarely included monsters in the most practical sense. Those maps were used for navigation, not decoration. But in the public-facing charts, those shown to royalty, sold to investors, or hung in salons, the monsters returned, especially around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, or the coastlines of the so-called Spice Islands. There, enormous fish churned the waves. Serpents with manes like lions snarled at distant coasts. In some cases, ships were shown in battle, not with pirates or storms, but with fanged beasts rising from below. This was more than drama, it was diplomacy. By presenting these regions as perilous, the empires made their navigational triumphs appear all the more heroic. If the seas were full of death, then trade was a victory over fate itself. If the lands were inhabited by monsters, or at least by people who could be painted as monstrous, then colonization became, in theory, a civilizing act. Even in places where monsters were absent, similar logic prevailed. Take, for instance, the curious inclusion of elaborate wind roses on nautical charts. These compass-like stars, often drawn in radiant colors, divided the seas into segments, siege, governed by one of the classical winds. At first glance, they seem purely decorative, but in fact, they were a subtle way of making the world appear ordered. By overlaying a chaotic, unknown ocean with perfect geometric lines, radiating like the petals of a flower, cartographers reassured their viewers. The world, even if dangerous, was still comprehensible. It followed rules, could be mastered, and in that mastery lay power. But what about the mapmakers themselves? Did they believe in the monsters they drew? The answer, perhaps disappointingly, is not always, or at least not as literal truths. Many cartographers relied on existing bestiaries books of mythical creatures dating back to antiquity. These bestiaries were full of allegorical animals: the phoenix that rose from ashes, the basilisk that could kill with a stare, and the manticore with the body of a lion and the face of a man. For centuries, these creatures were part of learned discourse. They appeared in cathedral carvings, in stained glass, and even in university lectures. The line between zoology and mythology was, as yet, faint, but by the 1500s, skepticism had crept in. With each voyage, sailors brought back better observations. With each returned ship, monsters began to lose their footing. And yet they lingered, perhaps because they were beautiful, perhaps because they sold maps, perhaps because they allowed the cartographer to indulge in a kind of quiet storytelling, a personal signature beneath the demands of kings and corporations. Consider the Venetian mapmaker, Battista Agnes, active in the mid-16th century. His hand-drawn maps, often illuminated with gold leaf and delicate color washes, included fantastical elements in otherwise accurate depictions. You might find a merman near the coast of India, or a griffin walking through Persia. What these embellishments were always in balance. Never too many, never too large. It's just enough to stir curiosity. One gets the sense that Agnes, like many of his peers, was navigating not just oceans but expectations. He had to please his patrons, maintain his accuracy, and still leave room for imagination. There's a special term used by some historians: cartographic silence. It refers to the deliberate omission of information on maps, places left blank, details avoided, names withheld. This silence could be practical. If a coastline was unknown, it was better to leave it vague than risk being wrong. But it could also be political. Colonial powers often omitted indigenous names or settlements, rendering a place empty and therefore ripe for claim. What's fascinating is how monsters functioned as a kind of reverse cartographic silence. Instead of leaving space blank, they filled it with myth. Rather than admit ignorance, the map said, "Yes, something's here. We just don't know what yet." In this way, fantasy became a placeholder for fact. It was an honest lie, and one that carried consequences. Over time, of course, the monsters began to disappear. By the late 17th century, maps grew more precise. Sea charts improved. Expeditions returned with detailed logs, and entire coastlines were redrawn. The Enlightenment brought a new disdain for superstition. Rationalism crept in like a tide. Wind heads were replaced by latitude lines. The ornate was replaced by the empirical, and the krakens faded into legend. But even then, some artists could not resist. Even in 18th century France, maps of imaginary lands like Carte de Tendre or Terra Incognito were published as social satires, filled with invented cities and allegorical monsters. They were jokes, yes, but affectionate ones. The ghosts of the old sea monsters lingered in their smiles. And so we return, once more, to the candlelit studio. The apprentice finishes inking the tail of the sea creature. It has curling fins wide, startled eyes, and just a hint of a smirk. He leans back, satisfied. The map is ready for inspection. His master, having stirred from his nap, comes over, squints, and says nothing. He taps the monster with a bony finger. "Make the eye a bit larger," he mutters. "It should look more watchful." The apprentice nods, adjusts, smiles. Outside, the wind rustles sails on the docks. Another ship prepares to leave. Another sailor prepares to bring back a story. And somewhere in an ocean not yet mapped, a sea monster swims quietly, waiting to be drawn. If you tilt a medieval or Renaissance map just right, let your eyes drift not to the center, but the corners. The scrollwork, the flourishes, you begin to see something surprising. Something playful. Amid all the serious geometry and pseudoscience the cartographer has left behind. A joke. Sometimes it's a ship tipped sideways as if caught in a whirlpool too ridiculous to exist. Sometimes it's a monk arguing with a penguin in the margins of a polar sea, or a fish with glasses reading a book beneath the waves. These weren't oversights. These were indulgence, tiny, gleeful bits of rebellion. When mapmakers got bored, they didn't merely doodle, they encoded wit into their work. And sometimes they used maps to poke fun at their patrons, their rivals, or even the world itself. Let us drift now, slowly and sleepily, into this more whimsical current of cartographic history. In the early 1500s, the German cartographer Martin Waldseemler became famous for giving the name America to the New World. His 1507 map, Universalis Cosmographia, was an ambitious project in an attempt to redraw the world using the latest reports from explorers like Amerigo Vespucci. But tucked along the edges of his map, beyond the coastlines and trade winds, are curious elements. A grinning windhead with crossed eyes, a unicorn-sized goat in the Alps, and a troop of lumpy, long-armed wild men who appeared to be tossing coconuts at one another in South America. Were these based on traveler accounts? Possibly. But it's more likely Waldseemler was being cheeky, recording the exaggerations of sailors with a nod and a wink. This was not uncommon. Cartographers were often caught between fact and fiction. Their patrons, whether royals, merchants, or universities, wanted their maps to look authoritative. But those same patrons also loved a bit of spice. A monster here, a curious tribe there, a volcano puffing smoke somewhere no volcano had ever puffed before. And so mapmakers walked a tightrope. They told the truth, but not the whole truth. They drew what was known, hinted at what was guessed, and when no one was watching, they laughed. One of the most delightful examples comes from the Dutch Golden Age. The Netherlands in the 17th century was a hub of trade, exploration, and mapmaking. Dutch cartographers like Willem Blaeu and his son Joan Blaeu produced some of the most exquisite atlases of the time. Their maps were richly colored, precise, and often decorated with lavish cartouches, those ornamental frames that surrounded titles and legends. But if you look closely at some of these cartouches, you'll find tiny scenes that have nothing to do with geography. On one map, a woman in classical robes lounges lazily with a globe, as if bored of holding it. In another, two cherubs are locked in a tug-of-war over a compass. In yet another, a monkey in a sailor's cap peers through a telescope pointed straight at a woman's bare shoulder. These weren't crude jokes. They were elegant mischief, playful, nods to the educated viewer, like the footnotes of a scholar who knows his audience is in on the joke. It's worth noting that many of these maps were collected not by sailors, but by scholars, courtiers, and the nobility. They were as much art as science. Art, even then, had room for humor. Some cartographers went further, using maps to satirize entire regions or ideas. In 1622, a German engraver named Matthias Marian published a map of Europe in the shape of a queen, known as Europa Regina, Queen Europe. The map was wildly symbolic. Spain formed the queen's crowned head, France her chest, and Bohemia her heart. Italy, naturally, was her arm holding a scepter. It was meant to flatter the Holy Roman Empire and show the continent as unified, noble, feminine, and divine. But not everyone agreed with such self-serious cartography. A few decades later, rival artists published a satirical version in which the same figure was reimagined with exaggerated features: a comically long nose, a misaligned crown, and crossed eyes. The once majestic queen now looked like a drunken aunt at a wedding. The message was clear. Cartography could be political, but it could also be parody. And as more people began to read and collect maps, their role as social commentary only grew. In the margins of British maps from the Georgian era, for instance, you might find tiny whispering jabs at the French. A map of the English Channel might feature smug little British ships sailing past French galleons with broken masts. Or there might be caricatures, frogs, and powdered wigs lurking near the coast of Normandy. These weren't just jokes, they were propaganda. The cartographer, like the cartoonist, had become part of the public conversation. And what better way to make your audience feel superior than by drawing your rivals as literal toads? But even within Britain, self-mockery was common. One map from 1750 playfully labeled the Scottish Highlands as "Here be bagpipes," and dotted the Irish Sea with barrels of whiskey marked "Floating Risk." Whether the mapmaker was Irish, English, or just mischievous is lost to history. But the message is clear. Even the most dignified charts were not above a little silliness. And then, of course, there were maps made purely for satire. In 1877, a British cartoonist named Fred Rose published Serio-Comic War Map for the year 1877, in which each country was drawn as a grotesque caricature. Russia was a giant, grasping octopus, its tentacles creeping ominously across Eastern Europe. Britain was a proud old sailor. France looked like a rooster in a fit, and Turkey, well, Turkey looked slightly dazed. This map wasn't meant for navigation. It was political commentary wrapped in geographic form. It warned of Russian expansionism, poked fun at continental squabbles, and entertained with its absurdity. It became wildly popular. Other satirical maps soon followed. The map of matrimony, a fanciful land where towns like Flirtation and Jealousy bordered Happiness Bay, and the Land of Good Intentions, complete with mountains of procrastination and a foggy region known as Someday. By now, the map had become pure metaphor, but the lineage was clear. From sea monsters to sarcastic states, maps had always been storytellers. Of course, not all cartographic humor was so grand. Some was just silly. Got the 16th century French map that included a creature labeled Poison de Marde, literally crapfish. Scholars aren't sure if it was a mistranslation, a sailor's tall tale, or a bored apprentice's prank that somehow made it to publication. But there it is, immortalized in ink. Or the anonymous 18th century map that shows a sea labeled The Wet Place, just off the coast of Harish. The kind of map one imagines was pinned to the wall of a tavern rather than a royal court. There's even evidence that some apprentices deliberately slipped small hidden messages into decorative scrollwork, jokes in Latin, initials of lovers, or small animals wearing spectacles. These weren't mistakes. They were reminders that mapmakers were people. Tired, clever, sometimes irreverent people, stuck at a desk for months. Carefully tracing coastlines for a client who might never appreciate the work. Why not give the world a wink? Even today, the spirit lives on. Modern cartographers and illustrators still leave Easter eggs in fantasy maps for novels, games, or movies. They hide dragons in clouds or include the cartographer's dog as a tiny explorer. Some fictional maps have become cultural icons. Think of the Marauder's map from Harry Potter or the sprawling continent maps in Game of Thrones. But even in the world of real geography, the tradition continues. In 1978, a Canadian cartographer named Doug Brown slipped a tiny image of a man fishing into a government topographical map of British Columbia. The image was so small it went unnoticed for years. When it was finally discovered, the government had to decide whether to recall and reprint the map. They didn't, because secretly they were amused. So the next time you see an old map, whether framed in a library or tucked into the end papers of a novel, pause. Look past the lines and labels. Tilt your head. Peer into the waves. Scan. The scrolls, there in the corner, you might find a penguin in a top hat, or a whale wearing spectacles, or a tiny cartographer painted with just 3 strokes of ink, waving at you from the bottom of the page. Not all maps tell you where to go. Some just remind you that, even in the most serious of places, someone, somewhere, was once having a little fun. As we move toward the later stages of early modern mapmaking, roughly spanning the late 17th to 18th centuries, the artistic peculiarities of maps grew even more elaborate. The scientific rigor of geographic precision was sharpening with better instruments and triangulation methods. That didn't stop cartographers from treating the margins of their maps like miniature art galleries. And one of the most enduring and charming flourishes in this artistic cartographic tradition was the cherub. These little plump, often winged children sometimes, mistaken for angels but technically known as putti, found their way onto countless European maps. They could be found in a variety of situations, blowing gusts of wind from cloud corners to indicate prevailing wind directions, holding up scrolls of text, or even just lounging in the frame's decorative border, smiling sweetly with no apparent purpose. In fact, entire symbolic vocabularies were created using these figures. A cherub puffing his cheeks while blowing a trumpet meant stormy winds in some Italian maritime maps. Others held hourglasses to suggest the passage of time or the importance of timely navigation. Occasionally, their inclusion seemed almost mischievous playful, inserts by bored engravers who had stared too long at outlines of coastlines. But perhaps most intriguing were the cartouche ornate panels or decorative scrolls that housed the title, date, scale, and sometimes the dedication of a map. These were not simple blocks of text. No, a cartouche might feature mythological gods, allegorical figures of the continents like a tiger riding Asia or a cornucopia holding America, or maritime scenes filled with Neptune himself waving a trident. A 1719 map of Africa by Guillaume de Lisle featured elephants and camels reclining in the shade of palm trees, while European traders looked on serenely as if partaking in an afternoon tea. On a 1747 map of the Arctic, cherubs were bundled in fur-lined hoods, huddling beside a brazier, presumably to keep warm while declaring the icy north. You, the imagined viewer of the time, were not merely holding a navigation tool, you were holding a storybook, an encyclopedia, and a cosmic map all at once. And yet, these flourishes were not only aesthetic, they were political. Including portraits of kings and emperors within cartouches, was a subtle assertion of territorial claim. When France included its royal crest on a map of the Americas, it wasn't just decorative, was declarative. It said without saying, "We were here first." And the biases embedded in these maps were often hidden in these images. Unfamiliar regions were populated with figures drawn from European fantasy, wild men, feathered savages, or animals exaggerated in scale. The unknown became an artistic playground for projection, fear, and sometimes condescension. Even more oddly comforting was the frequent appearance of Latin mottos and decorative ribbons, such as Hic sunt leones, here be lions, or Terra incognita, unknown land. These labels felt like whispered apologies from the cartographer. We didn't quite know it's here, but we tried to make it pretty. This mixture of fact, fancy, and filler might have frustrated later scientists and explorers. But today, those same oddities help modern historians reconstruct not just what early Europeans knew about the world, but how they felt about it. There's something soothing in knowing that, faced with the overwhelming task of depicting the vast, unknowable earth, these mapmakers resorted to doodling lions, puffing cherubs, and mysterious sea cows. And despite all the flourishes, they left just enough blank space to hint that the world was still full of mystery. One could imagine an old Dutch cartographer, glasses perched low on his nose, pausing over a blank space on the edge of the known world. Instead of marking it with scientific coordinates, he draws a gentle sea serpent one that smiles just slightly, its tail curling around a compass rose. It may not have been real, but it made the map feel less lonely. And in a way that was the point. The art in the margins wasn't there because the cartographers were lost. It was there because they hoped someone, someday, would fill in the rest.